So welcome to this afternoon. Hope you've all had a good conference so far. So I'm Paul Heaney with ProofID. I'm the CTO at ProofID, and I'm going to talk today about sort of untrustworthy and forgotten channels and securing those. So what we're going to cover today, so we're going to kind of look at, well, what digital channels do we have in our organisations? Which channels have we perhaps forgotten about? Where are our issues? And what can we do to improve that situation? And both from a security perspective and also from a customer experience. So one thing I'll just say at the beginning is I'm going to use the term customer to refer to both customers in a CIAB sense, people who are buying services from you, but also customers internally within your workforce, within your organisation, who are using your services. So when I say customer, I mean both those contexts. So what channels do we have within our organisation today? So we're all kind of well versed with sort of the web channel, doing things in a web browser, mobile through mobile apps and APIs. And we spent the last sort of 10 years working in this space. We've done a lot of work to secure these, to build sort of really good customer experience. So we've kind of used things like SAML and OpenID Connect to build these out and provide a single point of identity so you can authenticate across all these channels with one set of credentials. We've then sort of taken that further and brought in stronger authentication, multi-factor authentication using sort of biometrics and FIDO to provide a really good, strong authentication into there. We've also recently kind of started adding in things like sort of identity proofing to make sure not only is the person strongly authenticating, but actually the person who is authenticating is the person we think is authenticating. So we've got a very high degree of assurance that Fred is logging in and it really is actually Fred. It's not somebody pretending to be Fred. It's not Dan being evil again. Dan's never evil, by the way. And we've then, on top of there, kind of got the ability to plug in risk sensors, so be able to consume lots of information, so information about where the user's coming from, what their usual behaviour pattern is, what their usual devices are, etc. So we can plug all those risk sensors in and pull that into the overall picture to increase our security. And then when our sort of risk sensors define, this is a high-risk operation, so maybe logging in from Denver for once, and I usually log in from Manchester. Maybe I need to do some step-up authentication, or I'm making a high-risk transaction, so I'm going to make a large transfer. We can use sort of transaction authorization to authorize those particular transactions. And of course, we've got OAuth to secure those APIs. So we've done a good job in mobile, web, and API, but there's still more to go. There's a kind of a fourth channel in most of our organizations that we usually forget about or have purposely forgot about, buried our head in the sand, which is the telephony channel or the contact center, which everyone usually has, and sort of it's kind of buried away in the basement and nobody's really sort of pretending it doesn't exist, and sort of if I don't look there, it won't bite me. So kind of what's the typical flow today in a contact center? So a customer rings in and is asked to enter an account identifier. So maybe it's the credit card number, maybe it's the mortgage number, maybe it's the user ID. So they enter that, through the IVR, through the automated system, we've actually identified, well, yeah, this is Fred, or we think this is Fred. We then prompt you to authenticate, which we're doing this on a phone system. So this is going to work with the lowest common denominator. So all we can do from an authentication perspective is actually ask you to enter credentials that are based on numbers. So we've got 0 to 9 as possible input values. So we're a bit limited on what we could ask there. We could ask for the card expiry date. We could ask for the 4 digits off the back of the card. So we've asked for some details, but not very many. And then at this point, we can perform some automated operations in the IVR. We then get to a point where, well, the automation's not there, we need to do something, we need to speak to a real human, we need to speak to an agent. So we transfer the call to an agent, and the agent then starts with a kind of a super user access to the system and says, it's Fred. I'll just then start to operate and start to do information on their behalf. We're now going to do a high-risk operation, so we'll ask you for another piece of knowledge-based information. We'll ask you for what's your credit limit? What was your last transaction? Where did you last use your card? And at that point, we'll then do that sensitive operation. So we'll transfer all your money to another bank account. So those are kind of where we are today. Now, as you can see, this is fastly becoming the weakest link. So our web channel, mobile, is all now very strongly secured. We're now going to, and attackers are seeing this, realizing that actually, well, I can't compromise the digital channels anymore, so I'll just ring up and pretend I'm Fred. I can find out what his details are, and actually, probably the fraud actors have got a higher chance of getting the knowledge answers correct than a user. So where did you last actually use your card? I can't remember. Was it in Starbucks? Was it buying a sandwich? Where was that? And also, it's a very poor customer experience that, well, I'm ringing in because I've lost my card. I want to block my credit card. Well, what's my PAN? Where do I find my credit card number because I've lost the card? So it drives a lot of friction, a lot of aggravation with the customers. So we need to kind of look at how can we improve this. So there's a number of research been done into contact centres, and sort of looking at one, sort of when you ring into a contact centre, the average time is 11% of the call time is spent actually authenticating the customer, which a tenth of the call proving who you are. That this is frustrating for the customers, it's frustrating for the agents that they're asking all these questions, and actually all they want to do is help you with your banking, with your support request. That we don't want to spend our time trying to figure out, are you who you say you are? And of that then, between 15 and 30%, depending on the questions, of legitimate customers actually fail that authentication. So you ring up, well, what was your last transaction? Well, didn't use the account for a year, so I can't quite remember. Did I do that last transaction in April or May? Was it for £1? Was it for £10? I can't really remember. So there's a very high dropout rate of customers that just can't get through the authentication, so then can't solve their problem, which will ultimately lead to this customer just leaving their account to go dormant because, well, they can't close it because they can't authenticate. So it's going to lead to a high attrition of customers. So there's a customer experience angle here that we need to improve, but there's also a very much sort of a malicious actor perspective. So what could a malicious actor do if they ring up and get access through the call centre? So in the customer world, well, you could reset your credentials because you're probably ringing up in the first case because, well, I can't remember what my credentials are, but a malicious actor can also do the same. I've forgotten my password, or I've got a new mobile phone and my authenticator's on that phone. Can you unpair my device? And will then repair to a new phone, and that malicious actor can then access your account and do operations as you. You could then even change your contact details. So you might be getting, the organisation might send you a letter, say, oh, you just set up this new payment, or send you a text, say you've changed your address. But if I then change your email address, change your mobile phone number, change your home address, then those notifications are going to get directed to the malicious actor, or not get to the actual owner of the account, which is going to then sort of stop you realising that your account has been taken over until it's way too late. The malicious actor then might transfer the money out of the account, might transfer your hotel loyalty points, they might transfer your airline miles. From Rachel's keynote on Tuesday, they might change your seat reservation. So there's kind of lots of malicious things they could do. They could even then sort of even get even more malicious, if you can have levels of maliciousness, and actually open a new credit card or open a new loan, and actually then start to affect you personally, and the stress that would cause somebody and the financial challenges that's going to raise them, that could be quite significant. You could purchase items in your account, buy a new TV, etc. Depending on what the system is, what industry you're in, we might be accessing your customer data, your personal data. If you're a healthcare provider, then there might be medical records on here, which obviously highly sensitive. And in the enterprise, again, a lot of the similar sorts of things. You could open a support ticket with a help desk and sort of, oh, I'm having a problem with this application. Can you just approve this transaction for me? Or can you give me access to the finance system or the payroll system? And I can then start to approve and make fraudulent transactions through the organisation. I could perhaps get access to the Twitter account and be able to then start posting content that's perhaps not appropriate for the company, which then leads to lots of sort of reputational damage and ultimately leads to loss of business and maybe even the business going out of business, and lots more. Another kind of fairly disturbing statistics, this was from a survey of 25 banks, that 61% of fraud that they'd experienced had some interaction at some stage with the contact centre. So they'd run the malicious actor or the person performing the fraud had at some point engaged with the contact centre to start some transaction or make a change. So it was, again, sort of showing us the weakest link. So how can we kind of improve this experience, both from a security and an experience perspective? So we all know passwords are bad. Knowledge-based questions, so when your last transaction, your mother's maiden name, your first line of your address, they're all knowledge-based information, so we need to move away from using knowledge-based information in the contact centre. So moving away from there and utilising strong authentication, not just at the initial authentication time when you ring up, but actually then when you come to try and make a high value, a risky transaction, perform transaction authorization. From a customer experience perspective, we don't want our customers having to have multiple sets of credentials. You are a customer of the organisation. You should have one identity, one set of credentials to perform everything you do with that organisation, no matter whether you're doing it on the mobile, whether you're doing it through perhaps an open banking flow, whether you're doing it in a contact centre, even in theory, doing it in person in a branch. So we need to have a single set of credentials and a single method that the users are familiar with, that they're enrolled in and are used to using. Another thing that kind of with contact centres that they've been around a long, long time, that in the past they were typically integrated with the back-end systems directly through sort of database queries and sort of all sorts of hooks into the mainframe. As sort of these systems moving on, then we're using OAuth is becoming more and more prevalent. API usage is becoming more and more prevalent in these scenarios. So we need to use actually OAuth to authenticate to those APIs, but actually authenticate in the context of the customer. So we remove that super user account that we were previously using in the centres and having everything operate in the context of that customer. So if an agent goes rogue or an agent thinks they're being helpful, they can't actually start to access customer data without that customer being involved, being aware of that interactions. And also make sure that we continually authorise the transaction, that make sure that the customer who rung up at the beginning of the call that we authenticated is actually the same customer that we were speaking to at the end of the transaction, that we've not had a sort of somebody transfer the phone to their colleague or to the person stood behind them with a hammer and saying, ring up, authenticate, and then give me the phone. That we've got the same person engaged all the way through. So how can we take this forward? I'll apologise, I didn't choose the bright red colour. Seems to have got sort of slightly changed on the screen, but yeah, wasn't intended to be just that lurid. So in this new world, I kind of start at the top left, the customer rings in, the customer still has to identify themselves in some way, so we still need them to enter an account identifier, so the PAN. We then we need to prompt for authentication, and here we can start to use perhaps voice authentication. We need to do this over the public phone network, so the quality isn't as great as over a VoIP connection, so we've kind of got a less degree of certainty, a less degree of confidence of the user, but we've got a reasonable degree that this is who they say they are. So at this point, we can issue sort of a base level OAuth access token that allows the user, the customer to do certain operations, certain perhaps lower risk operations at that level. And then we need once we've got the access token, then we need the IVR to use that base token to actually access the APIs on the customer's behalf. So very much aligning with sort of the principles of zero trust. So that's great. We've been using this in the IVR. The IVR has been talking to the API gateway and doing great things. But we get to a point where the customer needs to speak to an agent, that we need to do something that's perhaps a little bit more complex. So the call gets transferred to a real life, living person to continue these operations. At this point, we need to pass that context, pass that access token, or pass an access token to the agent system where they can then continue to operate on requests on the customer's behalf. So continue and take that zero trust again to the agent side. And the agent system then uses that access token to continue operating on the customer's behalf. The next step, so we're going to do a high-risk operation, so we're going to make a payment of £1,000 to Greg because I'm bribing him for something, or so we initiate that high-risk operation. Well, we don't want to ask knowledge-based questions because that's got to be easy to spoof. So what we want to do is actually prompt the customer via an out-of-band method to perform that transaction authorization. So that might be sort of a push notification to their mobile phone. It might send them a one-time code via SMS if they're not enrolled in the mobile app. So they've got it's your great grandma who's using a really old sort of classic Nokia phone and sort of isn't perhaps as tech savvy. So we can then prompt that out-of-band method and be able to have the confidence that yes, we are talking to the right person, and then can perform the operation. And this is then all sort of continually underpinned by this continuous voice authorization. So making sure that the person who rang in at the top left is actually the same customer, the same person on the end of the phone that we were speaking to at the beginning, so that hasn't been taken over. So kind of from a take it to the next level, well, what protocols can we use to do this? So sort of the authentication is kind of fairly straightforward. But when we come on to doing the high-risk transaction, we've kind of got a number of actors here involved. So we've got sort of the customer in the top left. We've got sort of the contact center, the phone system. And I've sort of slightly abbreviated this diagram just to make it fit on a single slide. We've got an API gateway, an OAuth authorization server, a policy decision point, and the core backend system that we're trying to use. So the customer in this case has already rung up. We've done the initial authentication, and we then sort of try to do a high-risk transaction. So the customer tells the agent, transfer the £1,000 to Greg. The contact center system makes the API call to the API gateway, and that then says, great, I've received a request for this £1,000 transfer. I'm going to call the policy decision point. So every request I make, I'm going to make an external call to the policy decision point to say, well, do I allow this request to go ahead? Do I deny this request? Or do I perhaps put some additional requirements on this request before it goes ahead? So maybe we say we want to do strong customer authentication. We want to have this transaction authorized. And the PDP can pull data from multiple sources and use that to make a risk-based decision. So it's going to pull information from all these risk centers. So from the fraud system, from the sort of the various back-end systems potentially, have I paid Greg have I paid Greg before? Makes an impact on the risk profile. So the PDP comes back and says, okay, we need to do transaction authorization here. At this point, the API gateway receives that sort of obligation to do step-up authentication, and then initiates a CIBA request to the authorization server, passing sort of, well, this is the customer, and this is the details of the transaction. So payment to Greg, it's for $1,000 or £1,000, stick with the same currency pool. And the authorization server then says, great, I've received that request, I'm going to ask the customer to authorize this transaction. So at this point, the agent tells the customer, okay, thanks, we just need you to authorize this transaction. You should have received a push notification to your phone, or you've received an SMS, depending on what the customer's enrolled for. And once we've done that, then the customer hopefully has received the push notification, hopefully the technology has worked, and the customer gets that push, and in the mobile app says, accept, this is me, I've authorized this request. At which point, sort of the app's module made the call back to the authorization server to say, great, this transaction's been approved. And we then continue on with the transaction. With CIBA, there's a couple of ways we can do the callback. So either the API gateway can kind of keep polling the authorization server, say, has this request been completed, has it been authorized? Or we can have a callback from the authorization server to the API gateway to say, this has been done, this has been authorized. And we then get finally, out at the end, the API gateway will then progress that transaction and send it down to the back end to actually allow that transfer to be done, and Greg gets his £1,000. You're welcome. So this is kind of all underpinned by sort of the continual authorization. So as we said, sort of using biometrics, so just kind of observing what the customer is saying on the phone and building up that pattern and being confident in who they are. And kind of from a sort of continual authorization perspective and voice biometrics, it's going to analyze the call for kind of a number of things really. So kind of sort of the tone and pitch. So how are you speaking? And then sort of the behavioral characteristics. So kind of your accent and your idiosyncrasies. So how do I talk? And people say I've got a quite distinctive accent and sometimes difficult to understand with the sort of the Northern English accent. So it's sort of that's the kind of things that we're looking at here. So kind of wrapping it up. So what do we see as the key takeaways from this? So don't forget about all the channels you got within your organisation. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, the phone systems are kind of antiquated and a whole different beast, but it is a point where customers are interacting. It is a weakness, or it is a potential attack vector into your organisation, so don't forget about it. Need to move away from those knowledge-based authentication to stronger authentication methods, and where possible, kind of use biometrics and use the same authentication across all your channels. Kind of utilise sort of open standards, so CIBA and OAuth, and ultimately, this will allow you to free up your agent's time to actually spend helping your customers rather than sort of challenging them with questions they just don't know the answer to or get very frustrated with in the authentication stage. And kind of the last thing I'd like to leave you with, and as I've been thinking this through and kind of working with customers doing deployments of contact center authentication and authorization, I've actually kind of come to the thinking, well, this is great. This could actually also work for face-to-face scenarios. You go into your branch, how do I know who you say you are? Just because you've turned up and said, I'm Fred, and I know I've got the card, how do I know I'm Fred? We could send a push notification to your mobile phone in branch, and we could authenticate you. And so with that, thank you, and questions?
Thank you. Nice presentation. Speaking of weak links, I might be the only one in the audience that doesn't really know, but I just looked it up, and one of your last slides said use OAuth, use OAuth over the telephone exchange. So but isn't OAuth intrinsic to the internet? And what if you have a telephone, God forbid, that's analog? And or not hooked up to the internet. Yeah. How does OAuth play into real telephone exchange? Good
question. So OAuth's all about protecting the APIs that you're calling. So in a kind of typical sense, you kind of got an OAuth client and the OAuth sort of authorization server in the resource server. So you've got the app, you're authenticating in a mobile app and making a request to sort of or making a call to a resource server. In a contact center, we've still got that step of authentication, but kind of the actors are perhaps slightly different. The OAuth client effectively becomes the phone system. You authenticate through the phone system, and you can issue an access token to the phone system. And the phone system kind of has been effectively a proxy in between that you've given the phone system, well, your credit card number and your whichever authenticators you used, and then that gets access to the APIs an access token, and then can call those resource server APIs on your behalf. So it's a very valid use case for OAuth, but it's one that's not very widely documented or kind of considered. People very much use it in the securing the mobile and internet-based operations.
Is there any best solution to get rid of KBA? I mean, usually if any other mechanism fails, you go for KBA. But is there any other solution that can replace the KBA?
So I think it depends on the organisation. If the customer's already enrolled in a mobile phone-based authenticator, or they're already enrolled in some other authentication method, then that can very much replace the knowledge-based questions, knowledge-based answers. If you've yeah, if you've not got those customers enrolled, then yes, there is an enrollment step you've got to go through, but typically a lot of organisations are going through they've got online channels and they've got the telephony channels, so you can use those, the authenticators that you've enrolled customers into in those other channels to authenticate that. And yeah, you might still need KBA as that final fallback in case of customers that haven't registered for mobile or have lost all the mobile device and become have lost all their digital assets.
I was just trying to think through the scenario where a customer has a mobile device and then they get push request or SMS in that CIBA push authorization flow. I'm just trying to think of the scenarios where the user has such a device but is being forced to call, but then is still using their mobile device to interact in what would normally traditionally we might have thought as like a web-based flow. I'm curious if there's just an assumption here that the user is being forced to call in when they might have otherwise wanted to interact through a web-based browser.
So I think there is that, yeah, there's obviously there's a drive to try and do everything as digitally and without needing to ring in as much as possible. But there are cases where perhaps they can't perform the operation they need online, or there's certain operations that need to transition to an agent for. But yeah, ultimately the goal would be I think the utopian dream is that we can actually close the contact centres down and do everything online, do everything digitally. But it's that phase where there's 10% of the operations you can't do, or you need to actually speak to an agent because it's your great grandma and she's not perhaps as digitally savvy. And that's a great case where using CIBA and using push notifications is perfect, is great. But yeah, you've got your great grandma who's not able to use a smartphone or doesn't have a smartphone.
Well, we're out of time, so I want to say thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
And as a reminder to everyone, please fill out the survey in the app or in the platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you.